Thank you, Silva. Thank you, everyone. Welcome. So, our story really begins in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, this wall was a symbol not only of a physical divide, but an ideological divide between both East and Western Europe, the fall of which saw two very predominantly different opinions on its result. From the West, we had large push for people saying this was a good thing, and they promoted the values of Western liberal democracy and free market capitalism ideas. For the East, these changes brought about tectonic shifts which shook the lives of more than 300 million people. And as communism across the world capitulated due to calls for freedom and democracy, these people who were involved really had one very important decision to make. And that was, what do we do now? The families had this big choice, and it was a very difficult one to make. So A, you either stay and see out the changes that were promised, and most likely live in a country that you wouldn't recognize for good or for bad over the next 30 years. Or B, pack up your things, move to a hopefully better life and world for yourself. Now, naturally, this decision was marred in risk and unpredictability, no matter what you chose. And I know this from personal experience because my family had to make that exact same choice over 30 years ago. And we live with the consequences for good and for bad ever since. Now, why am I telling you this? The reason is twofold. Firstly, it's to really show where the person who's speaking in front of you today comes from. Because these ideas of how countries rise, how they fall, and what it takes for them to grow and develop has been something that has stayed with me and I've pursued throughout my life. And secondly, it's very important to realize that the same reasons as to why we moved, as well as many millions of others, are the same reason why so much is happening today. Capital flight, human flight, and whatnot. And I believe right now, in 2022, we have a very urgent need to better understand these tectonic changes of globalization, world affairs, and power more than ever before. Okay? So this will be done in three main points throughout the rest of this talk. Firstly, I'm going to identify what the main problem we face today in world affairs analysis is. Then we're going to present our solutions to these problems. And then we're going to be discussing really the benefits that we will see by using these new solutions. Yes? So before I begin, I want to show you some pictures. If this clicker works, probably doesn't, but we'll get this fixed, don't worry.
Go on, try now.
Yeah? So these are just some images from the shifts that we saw happening back 30 years ago. But the place that we begin is the same place that I think we should all begin when asking these questions of world affairs. And the question that we start off with as a company, why we were made in the first place, is to answer the question as to what will be the main changes and challenges to the world over the next 100 years. And the reason we have this 100 years outlook is because we believe the changes that we face today need a very long-term outlook when making decisions. Now, as a show of hands, how many of you in this room, in your roles, have ever asked yourself that question for such a long-term outlook? Please raise your hands high. Over 100 years. Okay, one. Now, you may think, why 100 years? The reason we ask this question for 100 years is because no one else really does. But if you notice why this happens, it's because governments tend to have a very short-term time horizon. Every 4 to 5 years, we're making decisions. Investors typically have even shorter time horizons, typically every quarter, when figuring out what the next quarter has to offer, and they hedge their risk by thinking this way. Very rarely do we see longer-term time horizons than this. But the issues we're facing today, as really a human society, need a much longer time horizon when making decisions. So this comes to our point number one. What is the main problem? The main problem is that what we currently have in the world is a thematic understanding of world affairs. So what does this mean? This means that when making decisions on world affairs, we tend to focus on fixing the risk that is in front of us today. So be it globalization and trade wars, be it geopolitical uncertainties across the world, be it transformative technology that's impacting the world in many different ways, or be it societal changes. But this approach really doesn't work for two main reasons. Firstly, I think it has a self-perpetuating impact, meaning the more you think about fixing the next crisis, the less you're thinking about what this means for our structures and what this means for our government policy and also for our investment policy. And secondly, this is really an opportunity cost, meaning the more you think this way, the less you're thinking in other ways, which could potentially yield better ways of doing business and better ways of making policy. So this is the problem that we aim to fix. And the solution, by the way we understand it, is the GPI. So in order to understand the GPI, what we really needed to do and to get a grasp on is, first of all, agreeing on some assumptions on how the world works. Because once you have this, you can really move forward in understanding why things happen as opposed to only focusing on what's happening, okay? So the first assumption that we make is that the nation state is the most important and the most fundamental sovereign human way we've organized society today. Nothing goes beyond it in power and influence, and things stream out of it. So whether it be institutions like the WTO, the World Bank, the UN, the IMF, etc., all of these institutions were created by nation states to serve them. We have people who are citizens of them. We have wars that happen inside them and between them. And we have trade barriers which are placed at the borders of them, and business happens between them. So that's the first assumption that I think is a fair one to make. Secondly, we need to define what power actually is in this context. Because in many other contexts, you can define it in many different ways. But as it comes to understanding it through this lens, power, the way that we've understood it, is very simple. And that is the ability for a nation state to secure its own interests. So one more time. It's the ability for a nation state to secure its own interests. And thirdly, we need to agree on the fact that all nation states want power. So if we agree on all these three factors, we can then move forward and make some really tangible movements forward in our understanding. But then the next question becomes, how does a nation state secure their interests? What avenues do they have, and what corridors can they go down when enacting their power on the world? And this is really the crux of the GPI. And if you understand this and what this means, you are really able to understand the why behind the what. Not thematics, but underlying why cause and effect happens. So the way that we've solved this is by creating a concept called centers of power, which are sixfold. So throughout our analysis, we've come to understand that a nation state can grow and develop on 6 different dimensions, be it their active consumer market, their military balance, their technological leadership, their geostrategic positioning, their systemically important commodities, and their financial strength. All these things together come up and they create what the GPI is and the fundamental basis of understanding what the GPI is. And if we can go one step further, which we've done, i.e. quantifying this, we are in a very good position to really understand how power looks like now, how it looked like in the past, and more importantly, how can we project into the future? And I think this is the key which we help solve. And this understanding and this insight is truly like something that we've never created before and we haven't seen before in the global marketplace of understanding world affairs. Because once you understand how a nation state grows on all these 6 factors, you're able to understand the pressures that they face and also what solutions you can bring as policymakers and also as investors to these parts of the world. So that's what we did. But we went one step further also. In making this, we knew that we had to quantify it, because this, in theory, is a purely academic practice. And that's something that we're not. So when it comes time to quantifying it, we had to think what would be key variables to include in each of these centers of power to make them quantifiable and to make them useful to both of these audiences, the investors and the policymakers. So that's what we did. So we used a number of variables between 50 and 100 to create the fundamental basis of quantifying these centers of power and bringing them to this audience. And the 2022 index is what we're about to present, and this is what you're going to see presented today. A few more words before I actually show you the index, which is why you're all here. The first thing is that each sub-index is in correspondence to each of these centers of power. So we have an active consumer market sub-index, which is corresponding to the active consumer market center of power. We have a military balance sub-index, which is, again, associated with the center of power, so on and so forth. And these are scored between 0 and 100. And then we went again one step further by putting these all together and creating the super index, which is the Global Power Index, which is what you're going to see today. Okay? And the super index, which is the Global Power Index in blue, is ranked out of 0 to 600. 0 meaning fledgling power, and 600 meaning maximal power of a nation state. Are you ready to see the index? Okay, I can see a lot of enthusiasm in the room today. Okay, so this is for everyone at home and everyone watching on Zoom. Okay, and once I show this, feel free to take pictures, but you will be sent this anyway through correspondence into the future. But this index, I forgot to mention, ranks 113 countries across 7 different regions. And you can see in color the regions and the countries, but you'll see each country more specifically then. The colors which are in gray are the nations which we haven't collated data on, but in the next round of indices which we'll create next year, we'll have more countries added. So this is how the world stands right now. And it's our most advanced index to date because we've updated our analytics and we've included a lot more countries than last year. Okay? So drum roll, please, for the index. I wish we could have sort of a Steve Jobs style sort of entrance here, but I guess it's probably not as spectacular, but very important for this audience here today. So once I show this, I'll step back for you guys to analyze it, and then we'll come back in a minute or so, and we'll continue on with our talk, okay? Feel free to take pictures, but you'll get this also on an email. Feel free at this point to jot down questions if you have them for the Q&A, or to further examine them, and then we'll get back to a point. Just to ask for the Zoom, can they see this as a screen, yeah? Okay, great.
Can you increase the screen here?
To increase the size? The sizing you want?
The size of the screen, can you increase
Can we do that?
it here?
You need to zoom in on this. I'd have to come out of the slideshow.
Okay, if you could. Which part do you want to see?
Maybe we can start from the beginning.
The top? We're going to get there, don't worry.
You should have sat at the front.
Yeah? Well, we're going to actually zoom in our next slide, in fact. So you're going to be able to see something very interesting which we've created, okay? Thank you for this. Okay, so again, this will be sent to you guys via email, so you have a chance to see this. But let's just take the top 10 for the moment, okay? Because I know everyone's eyes went up to the top, naturally, okay? But before we talk about the top 10, I think what's important to stress about this index is that what we didn't want to create is who are the top dogs and focusing only on them, okay? Because the world is bigger than just the top 10 countries in the world. And as nation states' power grows, we will see changes happen in different parts of the world, which will be impacted by the countries which go across the index and not only the top 10. Because the issues that we're faced in the world today are not only caused or as a result of only the top 10, for example, but they are an amalgamation of different countries working together, working against each other to fulfill their aims, which is power, which is to secure their own interests. And for an investor who's looking at this, they can gather some very key data, not even having the scores, because as you can see, the scores are blotted out because they come next. But they're able to see where nation states lie, and we're going to show you some analytics now, some sort of general things that we can extrapolate from not only the top 10, but any segment you want, okay? Because this is a very malleable index and can be used for both of these general audiences, the policymakers and the investors, okay, in different ways. And if you want to talk more about that, we can cover that in the Q&A, okay? So if we focus on the top 10, this is the picture that we see. First of all, we have some themes that run through the top 10 that are important to realize, okay? So the first one is that on the top left, we're starting top left and going down and then on the right, okay? So all the P5 nations are part of the top 10. Secondly, we can see there is a shift towards Asia being the majority of the countries which are focused in the index. So 4 out of the 10 are in the Asia Pacific. Thirdly, half of these nations speak English or have English as an official language. So this harks back to sort of the influence of the British Empire and harks back to sort of soft power that that side of the world still incurs today. Also, all of them are part of the OECD, right? The average GDP of these nations is 5.1 trillion. Also, we need to see is what is not and who are not in the top 10. Not only who is, but who is not in the top 10, which is important. We see out of these regions, 5 out of the 7 are in the top 10, meaning Sub-Saharan Africa and South America aren't ranked, or at least aren't represented in the top 10 of the GPI. Okay? So as you can see here, no sub-Saharan African nation nor South American nation is ranked in the top 10 in the global GPI, right? If you look at individual indices, the picture changes. But when you put them together and amalgamate them together, this is the picture that we see, okay? So feel free to take some more notes on this if you want to ask some questions, but this is just, and you'll get these slides anyway, okay? Secondly, what we try to do is, first of all, understand what kinds of organizations exist in the political realm that exist due to their influence across the world. And there are many. We mentioned the P5, we mentioned the OECD, but we also have things like the G7, for example, which is in the news quite significantly now, especially with the ongoings across the world. And the G7 were once the G8. And as politics has its toll, and as these partners come together for specific reasons, they create these organizations to mimic perhaps their sense of what is important to represent in a grouping, and also they pick certain aspects of a nation to include, meaning the G7 compared to what we call the GPI 7, which is the top 7 nations that we've ranked, based on objective data, based on not on sort of political alliances and on ideologies which bring certain nation states together, right? We compare the two to see how they sort of rank up against each other. And we see certain nations which are in both, but we also see certain nations which aren't in both and are interchangeable. So, for example, we have Singapore is not in the G7, but is included in the GPI 7. Australia is not in the G7, but included in the GPI 7. So what the GPI tries to do is measure, again, nations on their centers of power and culminate what their influence is in the world. But the G7, because it was once upon a time the G8, can be seen as more of a political and ideological grouping of wealthy nation states that come together for objectives. Naturally, there are other players which are involved in the G7, but this is just a high-level representation of the differences. And we can go into why I think this is important in the Q&A also, okay? Okay, so I guess we're going to also end it with a question, okay? And that is the question that we started off this talk with, or why we exist as an organization to begin with. And that is, how will the world be changed and challenged in the next 100 years? And if you take anything from this talk, it is to go back to your nation states, to go back to your embassies, to go back to your investment houses and corporations, and start a conversation over the long term. Because we all know how the short term works. We all see it happening every single day. And we know the anxieties that brings up in us and the uncertainties that brings up in us when we only focus on thematics when we analyze world affairs. But to truly have, I believe, a much more longer term view on how the world is functioning and why, importantly, the world is moving the way that it is, these questions need to be asked. If not 100 years, at least extended more. The 100 years outlook is an aim to stretch your thoughts, but we need to be thinking in much more longer term horizons as opposed to short term ones. Thank you so much. Yeah.